One of the police officers charged in the killing of George Floyd is Thomas Lane. Thomas Lane has hired a lawyer named Earl Gray, and I can tell you this guy is not at all lemony and mild like Earl Grey tea. He's actually quite the opposite. And he imploded on live television last night. He was interviewed by CNN's Chris Cuomo, and Earl Gray tried to suggest that if bystanders were really so concerned with how George Floyd was being manhandled by police, why didn't the bystanders jump in to restrain the police? He actually says this, and then he has no choice but to back away from it when Chris Cuomo tells him how bonkers it is.
But if all of these people say, why didn't my client intercede? Well, if the public is there and they're so in an uproar about this, they didn't intercede either. And my client's down where he can't really see.
Hold on, Counselor, hold on.
Yes,
Two things. One,
yes.
You're laying on a man's legs. You've got a fine view of what's going on with that man. The other officer is literally a foot in front of you on his neck. Two, I understand that he has a senior officer telling him what to do, but there's also a duty to intervene. And if you think an officer is doing something that's dangerous to a civilian, you have a duty to intervene. And he did not intervene. And the idea that the civilians should have rushed in to a policing situation in the inner city of Minneapolis against 4 police officers that have weapons and are kneeling on the neck of a man, don't you think that's asking a little much of civilians and a little too little of your client?
Absolutely. I just brought that up. But what you say is that he's a foot away. Look at the video. He's got his feet. He was holding his feet down. Officer King was next, and then Chauvin.
So obviously the suggestion of civilians intervening against armed police is ridiculous. And Earl Gray realized it and has to back off and say, well, I'm merely bringing it up. Could this guy possibly be a good lawyer? His defense of his client, Officer Thomas Lane, was to ask, why didn't civilians commit a crime? Because if civilians actually go and try to interfere with 4 armed officers in the process of restraining and subsequently killing George Floyd, they would have been arrested and likely charged with interfering with law enforcement. Now, this is a good opportunity to step back and give you a sense of, in general, how the other officers, meaning the ones that were not Derek Chauvin, might approach their defenses. The idea is to say there was a power dynamic. These guys like Thomas Lane, who is represented by attorney Earl Gray, they were following orders. They weren't really in a position because of seniority differences to disagree, even if they wanted to. Now, here's our friend Josh Campbell, former FBI agent, CNN reporter, friend of the David Pakman Show, asking Earl Gray about, is the power dynamic thing what you were going with? And Earl Gray didn't like it at all. Take a look.
Were you kind of implying a power dynamic between the senior?
Well, isn't there?
I'm asking
they
you.
They call him sir.
Right, but is your claim that he was following orders your client?
No, I'm not claiming he was following orders. I'm claiming that he thought what he was doing was right because he asked the training officer, should we roll him over? Twice. You got to have criminal intent for second-degree murder. And frankly, this is bullshit.
So Earl Gray getting very upset there with a pretty straightforward question from Josh Campbell. And then again, another example. This is Earl Gray explaining, my client couldn't really do anything. I mean, he couldn't restrain Derek Chauvin. Take a look.
It'd be unreasonable for my client to go up and try and drag Chauvin off of the deceased. You've got a 20-year cop in the front, and my guy's back there with 4 days. Shall we roll him over? And he says, no, we'll wait for the ambulance twice. And then he says he's suffering from a delirium. I don't know what you're supposed to do as a cop.
So that's the gist of at least how Earl Gray will seek to defend Thomas Lane's actions in the killing of George Floyd. He was only on the job a few days. He didn't have the power dynamics on his side. He did suggest rolling George Floyd over, and he couldn't really physically restrain Derek Chauvin anyway, which is probably accurate. He physically restraining Derek Chauvin was not a likely path. So we've talked about many reforms, by the way, but one that might benefit police is to reorganize some of these sort of standards of the chain of seniority. There's a really interesting story that Malcolm Gladwell tells in his book Outliers, nearly 12 years ago at this point, about South Korean pilots, which explained that South Korean culture precluded co-pilots from pointing out to captains, hey, I'm seeing something that doesn't look right. And under that cultural norm, South Korean aviation was not particularly safe. And so South Korean airlines retrained and said, listen, in the cockpit, we have a different protocol than in Korean culture. And first officers not only should be allowed to, but they should be encouraged to point irregularities out to captains. You won't be punished. It's the right thing to do. And when they reorganized that norm, cultural norm in this case, South Korean aviation became dramatically safer. And much the same way, it is probably true that an officer on duty for 4 days, this is not a defense of Thomas Lane, but that one element is true, in police culture, in the ranks, it would be seen as inappropriate or unacceptable to question the tactics of the senior officer in that particular case. That needs to be changed, and that is totally separate from how any of these individual charges are ultimately going to play out. Let's take a quick break. My interview with Neil Ferguson is next. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. This episode is sponsored by Blue Chew. One of the things I make a priority on the show is not to perpetuate stigma for things that don't deserve it. We've talked about mental health. We've talked about many things where we should all just be respectful adults, period, and we would be better off. And Blue Chew can increase performance and give you that extra confidence you may be looking for. BlueChew.com, blue like the color blue, is the first chewable with the same FDA-approved ingredient as in Viagra and Cialis. It can be taken day or night, even on a full stomach, since it's chewable. It works twice as fast as a pill. Whenever the opportunity arises, Blue Chew is prescribed online by licensed doctors. You don't have to go to a doctor's office. You don't have to wait in line at a pharmacy. It ships right to your door in a discreet package. They're made in the USA, and since Blue Chew prepares and ships direct, it's cheaper than a pharmacy. And best of all, no more awkwardness. We've got a special deal for our viewers and listeners. Go to BlueChew.com. Get your first shipment free when you use our promo code PAKMAN. That's PAKMAN. Pay just $5 shipping. That's BLUE Chew.com. Promo code PAKMAN to try it totally free. Blue Chew is the better, cheaper, faster choice. And we thank them for sponsoring The David Pakman Show.